No single place should be able to hold all of this. A coast where it rains more than 200 days a year. And a desert that grows wine and peaches. Glaciers you can stand beside on the highway. And beaches where people surf. A town built to last with nobody living in it, and a few hours south, a gold rush town frozen exactly as it was 100 years ago. All of it is one province. This is British Columbia. It's bigger than France and Germany put together, and outside one crowded corner, hardly anyone lives in it. The ones who do are spread thin across the fjords and the forests, and almost none of them would live anywhere else. That's the part worth staying for. Not the scenery, but the reason people build a life this far from everything. Stick with me to the end of the province and you'll see exactly why. The people who choose it are usually after one thing: room. Of the roughly 5 million who live in British Columbia, more than half never leave the southwest corner. The rest are scattered so thin that some towns have no road in at all, reachable only by boat or float plane. Out there, a working family can still have a whole inlet to itself, or a valley with no neighbour in sight, and most would make that trade again without thinking. The living comes out of the land and the water. Salmon, timber and ore built these towns, and the land has a habit of giving everything and then taking it back. A gold rush that emptied as fast as it filled, a mine that closed and pulled a whole town down with it. The First Nations of this coast were here long before any of that, thousands of years, with languages rooted in a single valley. But it's the food that tells you the most about these people, because on this coast a table was always how you said someone belonged. A salmon feast was never only a meal. The fish came in by the thousands every fall, and a family's standing came less from what it kept than from how much it could give away. Salmon split and smoked over alder to last the winter. Halibut and spot prawns pulled fresh from the same bays their grandparents fished. The songs and the carved family crests around the fire carried as much weight as the food, and to be handed a plate was to be told, plainly, that you were one of them. It held inland too, where the sockeye fight their way hundreds of miles up the Fraser into the dry canyon country. There the summer catch gets smoked and canned in backyards through the heat, set aside so that winter still tastes like home. From rivers the same families have fished for longer than anyone can count. Ask one of them why they stay, and you rarely get a speech. They were born here, their parents are buried here, and what holds them is the kind of thing you can't put a price on. You're about to see all of it for yourself. Follow the province to its far edges, and the reason anyone builds a life this far from everything will answer itself. There is a peak on the very rim of British Columbia, so sharply pointed it looks almost sketched with a knife. A summit so cleanly cut that climbers nicknamed it the Matterhorn of the Rockies. That peak is Mount Assiniboine, rising as the highest point in the southern Canadian Rockies, right where two provinces quietly meet. A story says it got its name when a geologist saw a ribbon of cloud trailing from the summit like smoke, and thought of the Assiniboine people, often translated as the ones who cook with hot stones. Its near-perfect pyramid was carved less by wind than by ice, with glaciers chewing at different faces of the peak until the rock stood as a sharp, clean wedge. For years, climbers fell short of the summit, driven back by storms and sheer walls, as if the mountain itself were choosing who could stand on top. Even now, it feels less like something to conquer, and more like something that watches back, holding its ground above valleys that fall away toward a softer, wetter country. Downstream and westward, clear alpine ridges break into dripping coastal forests in a place known as the Great Bear Rainforest. It is one of the largest temperate rainforests on Earth, a soaked green maze of huge cedar trunks and moss that drips from branches like wet fur. Storms roll in from the Pacific and hammer the coast so often that some valleys feel more like a giant sponge than a forest. In small villages along this coast, families still gather for salmon feasts, where stories, songs, and clan crests hold as much weight as the food on the table. Several distinct language families are rooted here, and cultural protocols emphasise strong respect for the land and animals, treating wildlife as part of the community. In fall, quiet rivers suddenly fill with salmon, so many that the water looks silver, and even the shallows seem to move. Bears, wolves, and even forest birds race to that silver flood, hauling salmon into the trees and feeding the forest with every scrap they drop. People here say the forest eats the ocean because salmon from the sea end up as food for moss, ferns, and even the tallest trees. On calm days, fog slips between the trees, and boats creep through narrow channels because a whale, sea lion, or even a coastal wolf might appear without warning. Coastal First Nations tell of rare white bears in these woods, said to be pale so people will remember a time when ice covered the world. Those pale bears, called spirit bears or Kermode bears, move softly through the dim green light, almost fading into the mist around them. A spirit bear is actually a black bear with a snow-coloured coat, like someone pressed the invert colours button on the forest. That pale fur acts like a kind of river disguise. From below, salmon looking up see a bright shape against the sky and hesitate just a moment longer before fleeing. When one stands in a stream, it can hold so still that only its nose and ears move, becoming a quiet, living net with pores in the current. Food from those salmon does not stop at the bear, because leftover fish ends up on the ground, in the soil, and even in tiny plants that carpet the forest. Many of them keep to shaded corners of the rainforest, padding along old paths, and checking fallen logs that their families have used for a long time. They share these wet woods with darker black bears, wary wolves, and watchful cougars, so every footprint, claw mark and tree scratch doubles as warning and message. Some people from this coast say the pale coat keeps the memory of ice alive, so each calm encounter feels a bit like watching snow move on 4 legs. In another part of southeastern British Columbia, sun picks out old boardwalks and weathered wagons in the preserved town of Fort Steele. The town first grew on gold fever when tents turned into streets, saloons and shops almost as fast as the news could spread. Then the railway picked a different stop, and that single choice drained away the crowds until wind and dust were the loudest things on Main Street. Instead of fading, the place was restored, so the hotel, blacksmith shop, jail and homes now stand as if someone hit pause on a gold rush day. In the bakery, staff still load wood-fired ovens with loaves and sticky buns, so the smell of fresh bread and cinnamon connects local morning routines to recipes from over a century ago. Visitors can climb into horse-drawn wagons, hear iron rings on anvils, and watch people in old-style clothes act out chores that once paid the bills. Some locals joke that Fort Steele was killed by a train it never got, yet today more people arrive for its frozen past than ever showed up for its fresh gold. Dusty streets and creaking wagons slowly give way to rolling waves, cool salt air, and the softer pace of Ucluelet, or simply Yuki. On this wild edge of Vancouver Island, the coast has such a close bond with rough weather that people book whole trips just to watch storms. When winter seas rise, the Pacific slams into the rocks and throws up grey walls of water that blast into spray taller than the trees. On those days, the sound of each wave can feel like a freight train, with every hit shaking the air and rattling windows along the headland. Its name refers to people of the safe harbour, which feels like a dry joke when foamy waves are clawing at the shore. There is a kind of straight talk here, because this coast does not pretend the ocean is gentle. It shows water strong enough to toss logs around like toys. Some families still work the tides for salmon, halibut and seaweed, then pack freezers and smokehouses so winter meals carry the exact taste of nearby coves and reefs. Storm plans are almost social events, with neighbours checking on elders, sharing generators and hot food, and swapping stories about the biggest waves seen from the wild Pacific Trail. On calmer days, the same rocky points turn into easy walks and tide pools, where sea lions bob offshore and grey whales roll past beyond the breakers. Even then, each wave still carries a hint of storm power, as if the sea never quite forgets how hard it can hit. From stormy headlands to sun-baked canyon walls, the path leads on to Ucluelet, a Fraser River town shaped by the rush for gold. Here the river has carved a narrow canyon into the hills, so the town leans against dry slopes while the water slides far below. Summer's hit so hard that Ucluelet is known as one of the hottest places in Canada, with dry air that makes rock faces wobble in the heat. It is famous for its distinct microclimate that produces BC's best tomatoes and abundant stone fruits, as well as indigenous sockeye salmon, farm-to-table dining, and award-winning wines. Old wagon routes still thread the hills, but now they carry hikers and bikes to lookout points high over the cliffs and the winding Fraser. In late light, the slopes take on a copper glow and the river gleams below, so the scene feels more like a desert painting than the same province as stormy Ucluelet. Far to the north, the air cools and the coast returns, where a small port called Stewart lies at the end of a long inlet, ice-free even while nearby hills hold onto their glacier ice. That inlet cuts into the mountains like a long, narrow blade, yet seawater here stays open all winter, earning it a claim as Canada's most northerly, ice-free harbour. Because the water never closes, cargo once moved through this tiny port all year, supplying mines in the hills and tying a far-off border town into the wider world. Stewart shares an open border with Haida, Alaska. Because Haida has no road connection to the rest of the United States, residents rely on Stewart for services, groceries, and socialising. Residents in the area have long practiced informal bartering and resource sharing, as getting goods to this remote outpost can be difficult. Just beyond the docks, pale blue glaciers pour down toward the valley floor, close enough that drivers can pull over and stare straight into broken ice from the roadside. A short distance away, Ripley Creek Inn serves as a rustic lodge and heliski base, with former frontier buildings repurposed into guest rooms facing hanging glaciers. It's a strange kind of good luck to be rescued by warm salt water in a place this cold, as the coast bends south toward Telegraph Cove, a tiny village raised on wooden stilts above the tide. Here, homes and shops stand on tall pilings over the inlet, so the place feels less like a street and more like one long wooden pier with front doors. It all began as a single one-room shack at the very end of a telegraph line, the last point where messages could travel before the forest and sea said, "No more." From that cabin, more buildings crept along the cove, board by board, until the shoreline turned into a narrow row of paint, rope, and salt-scarred timber. Just off the stilts, cold green water drops into a busy channel, and boats head out at dawn, all watching for tall black fins on the horizon. On some mornings, only gulls, soft engines, and small waves under the boards break the silence, as if the whole place is quietly waiting. Then the surface ahead begins to boil with breath and spray, and orcas glide into view, hunting, playing, and rising so close to shore, it feels like the cove belongs to them. In these waters, they move in family groups called pods, tight teams that stick together for years, and travel like one big animal made of many bodies. Some pods here are fish eaters, politely noisy as they chase salmon, filling the bay with clicks and whistles that sound a bit like an underwater talk show. Each pod has its own set of calls, a kind of ocean accent, so scientists can tell who is speaking just by listening to the pattern of sounds. Other pods are the quiet hunters, the ones that stalk seals and porpoises with their voices turned off, holding their breath and slipping through the green water like black and white shadows. When these hunters finally strike, they move with sudden sharp bursts, turning calm sea into a fast swirl of tails, foam, and rolling backs. Calves learn it all by watching, tucked close to their mothers, copying every dive and breath until the shapes of the coast and the paths of the fish are stored in their heads. On some days the bay feels like a busy neighbourhood, with pods passing, calling, and surfacing in turn, as if the entire channel is one long meeting place for whales. Over the same channels, a much smaller hunter waits on logs and railings, as a belted kingfisher watches the ripples and lines up its next fish. This stocky bird wears a wild, spiky crest, then dives headfirst like a dart, disappearing under the water and popping back up with dinner in its beak. Instead of building in trees, it tunnels straight into a dirt bank, carving a long hidden burrow so its nest is tucked inside the shore. In a neat twist on the usual bird rule, the female is the flashy one, with an extra rusty band across her chest, while the male stays in simpler colours. Away from this busy little bird, Kitsault stands frozen in time, a modern town with almost no one left to call it home. It was built quickly and completely, with neat houses, a small mall, a pool, a hospital, and even a bowling alley dropped into a remote inlet to serve one mine. Then the price of that metal collapsed, and barely more than a year after families moved in, the town was told to clear out and the streets emptied. Instead of sagging into ruin, Kitsault was bought and maintained, so lawns are trimmed, roofs stay tight, and yet the rooms behind those doors stay mostly unused. There is even a spotless hospital where some medical equipment has never touched a patient, as if the building has been on standby for a call that never came. Trimmed lawns and empty rooms stand in sharp contrast to what waits ahead at Brandywine Falls, where water takes the fast way down. Here a river reaches the edge of an old lava flow and simply jumps, dropping in one clear white curtain into a forest gorge below. The cliff it pours over is made of stacked volcanic rock, layer upon layer of cooled lava piled like a stone cake, while the softer ground beneath has been worn away. That tough lava cap now works like a launch pad, so each drop looks less like a slide and more like the river taking one big step into thin air. The name adds its own twist, with a favourite tale saying two surveyors once argued about how far the water fell and settled it with a bet for a bottle of brandy. Whoever guessed closest, so the legend goes, kept the bottle, and the Falls took the name of that friendly wager instead of a dry official title. Beyond the gorge, the route follows old gold lines again to Brandywine, a town site that started as the third planned outpost for the Bralorne mines. Because of its harsh mountainous isolation, residents of the region must adapt with heavy off-road vehicles, rigorous emergency preparedness, and independent energy practices. It once fed off one of the most productive gold mining areas in the province, until the veins faded and the last crews drove away. After that, the streets fell quiet, and the whole place, houses, yards and lanes together, was offered for sale as a single item, like a very odd, slightly used town. Higher in the mountains, the road climbs toward cold glacier water and the three bright bowls of Joffre Lakes Provincial Park. Step into this valley and three lakes climb the slope, each one glowing such a sharp blue that it can look more like paint than water. That colour starts above them, where glaciers grind rock into fine powder and send it down in cloudy meltwater. Tiny rock specks float in the lakes like dust in light, and when the sun hits them, they throw back that milky turquoise glow. Photos of those colours spread fast, and soon long lines of visitors were all walking the same trail, each chasing their own perfect shot. Because of that popularity, you cannot just show up. Visitors must book a free day-use pass in advance, and there is no cell service at the trailhead to download it if you forget. Yet these waters lie inside the homelands of the Lillooet and Nkwakwa peoples, a place used for food and plant gathering, long before any hiking signs went in. To honour that and to give the valley a rest, the park now closes for part of each year to let local harvests continue and the lakeshores heal from so many feet. In that calmer moment, a curious Canada jay may swoop in, checking packs and hands like a tiny mountain thief. This bird, also called a grey jay or whiskey jack, stays in the cold forests around here all year, and instead of fleeing winter, it plans for it. Through the warmer months, it hides thousands of food scraps, pressing each piece into bark or cracks in branches, and sealing them in place with its own sticky spit. When snow covers the ground, and most birds are just surviving, it starts nesting, laying eggs in late winter, and feeding its chicks from that secret pantry. Parents move quietly between these hidden stores, making yesterday's leftovers today's breakfast for tiny mouths in a well-insulated nest. Hikers quickly learn that this planner is also a prankster, because a Canada jay will calmly land on a shoulder or knee and steal food right out of someone's hand. As the woods close behind the bird, another kind of stillness waits in Sandon, a once roaring silver town, now kept alive by only a small handful of locals. It rose in a tight valley split by a fast creek, full of saloons, breweries and bright electric lights, at a time when many other places were still squinting at candles. Silver pulled from the hills paid for that glow, but the same narrow valley struck back, first with fire racing through wooden streets, then with a flood that tore buildings into the creek. One local tale says the water carried off a spilled fortune in coins, scattering them along the creek bed where, some claim, they still lie under gravel and stone. Today the town is also known for two beloved comfort foods, Vida's famous hamburger pie and freshly baked bacon and egg muffins. From this narrow valley, the ground tilts upward toward the Canadian Rockies, the great stone spine of the continent. Along this spine, chains of peaks mark the Alberta-British Columbia border, steering storms, feeding rivers, and helping shape the line between the provinces. Much of the rock here was born on shallow seafloors, and later pushed up and folded, so standing on a ridge can mean standing where ocean mud and shells once lay. Glaciers still cling to many high ridges, carving new bowls and valleys, and sending cold meltwater down into fast rivers, and bright blue lakes loaded with glacial rock flour. In winter, snow piles so thick on some passes that roads close, while in the forests below, elk, wolves and bears work through a long, cold season, with less room than they once had. Storms often stall on these walls of stone, dropping rain and snow on the west side, then sliding drier air over the crest toward the plains to the east. The settlements here are small but tight-knit. With mountains towering in every direction, neighbours often rely on one another, creating a strong sense of camaraderie. Long before highways and rail lines, indigenous nations used passes and valleys here as travel routes, trade links and seasonal paths, reading this maze of peaks the way others read books. The region's food reflects both coast and mountain, combining Pacific smoked salmon, bannock, wild game such as elk and bison, and the sweet no-bake Nanaimo bar. Among these high ridges, one pocket is famous for its bright turquoise lakes and huge waterfalls, and that place is Yoho National Park. Its name comes from a Cree exclamation for sheer wonder, which fits a park where cliffs hold both roaring water and some of the strangest fossils ever found. High above the trees, a grey slope called the Burgess Shale locks in a seabed from long ago, when this mountain was the floor of a shallow ocean. A sudden mudslide smothered that seafloor, sealing soft-bodied creatures in place so gently that their eyes, guts, and even tiny feelers can still be seen in the rock. The fossils show a wild mix of odd bodies, spiky worms, feathered paddlers, and walking blobs that help scientists trace how complex animals first took shape. While that stone story draws researchers uphill, clear blue lakes below glow with colour because fine rock powder from nearby glaciers hangs in the water and scatters light. Around these lakes, rivers soar through the rock and leap off the edges in white curtains, soaking anyone who steps too close with cold spray. Among all these falls, one crashes so hard in spring snowmelt, it's heard before it's seen. It's Takakau Falls, a soaring wall of water turning melting ice into one roaring drop. The torrent begins as glacial melt high above, then shoots off the cliff in a bright white stream that seems to fall straight from the sky. Up close, the waterfall becomes a torn ribbon of foam and spray, twisting through the air before slamming into the rocks below. On warm days, the roar thumps in your chest, while drifting mist catches the sunlight and fills the air with tiny rainbows. When the cold returns and the glacier slows, the giant shrinks to a thin thread on the rock, as if someone upstream gently turned down a tap. The name Takakau comes from a word meaning "it is magnificent," which almost undersells a giant that bellows all summer before quietly settling down for winter. From the base, pale milky water races away, loaded with fine rock powder ground up by the glacier and carried downstream. That strange coloured flow finally settles in the unreal green waters of Emerald Lake. The colour comes from tiny grains of rock ground up by glaciers, hanging in the water and bouncing back green light to anyone who looks in. Around the shore, dark evergreens crowd the banks while pale cliffs rise behind them, their shapes reflected so sharply the lake feels like a doorway cut into the ground. On calm days, canoes slide over that mirror so smoothly they seem to float between two worlds, one above and one painted below. When wind skims the surface, the reflections shatter into ripples, and the whole lake turns into moving green glass under passing clouds. In winter, the water hides under snow and ice, so the first thaw looks like a magic trick as the colour returns and creeps out from the shore. Many visitors say it looks too bright to be real, like someone slid a filter over the world, yet it all comes from rock, ice and sunlight quietly working together. Once you leave this glowing lake behind, the next landmark is the great ice-covered peak of Mount Robson Provincial Park. Mount Robson towers over every other summit in the Canadian Rockies, so tall it grabs passing clouds and builds its own stormy cap. Often the very top hides under this grey hat, and people below can wait for days just to see the summit appear for a short, clear moment. On one side, a glacier slides down toward a lake and breaks apart at the shore, dropping chunks that drift like tiny icebergs across the water in midsummer. The whole scene feels like a set piece: white rock, blue ice, and clouds that keep changing shape around the peak. For climbers, these slopes are slow, painful work. For one local animal, they are just part of the daily commute. High on the broken rock, a sure-footed creature walks ledges as thin as a curb and hops between cliffs as calmly as most of us cross a road. That fearless climber is the mountain goat, perfectly at home in the thin air and steep walls that leave people gasping below. This animal treats sheer rock faces and finger-thin ledges like normal footpaths, crossing places where most of us would not even dare to look down. Each hoof works like a tiny climbing shoe, with a hard rim for bite and a soft, rubbery pad that presses into bumps in the rock and refuses to slip. Life up high is a choice. The goat feeds on small patches of grass, moss and shrubs that cling to cliffs, trading easy meals for harder ground that keeps trouble away. Predators rarely follow onto slopes this steep, so these ledges become sky islands where herds can raise kids with far fewer ambushes from below. The flip side is harsh because on these tilted homes, one loose stone or bad landing can send even an expert climber into a deadly fall. Thick coats, powerful shoulders, and short legs turn cold wind, ice and thin air into normal conditions, while we would be shivering and gasping beside them. From the valley floor, they often appear as tiny moving snowballs glued to vertical walls, like pieces of cloud that somehow learned how to walk. Steep walls and sure-footed goats are replaced by muddy streets, creaking wagons and old saloons in the preserved gold town of Barkerville. It all kicked off when a major gold discovery in the nearby creek set rumours racing, pulling in crowds until this remote camp swelled into one of the busiest spots on the frontier. Gold seekers poured in from across the globe, including many Chinese migrants whose businesses, homes and traditions became a vital part of its frontier life. Folks bragged that it was the grandest town for an enormous distance in every direction. Then a fire tore through and levelled most of the buildings, but instead of leaving, people grabbed lumber and rebuilt at speed because walking away meant giving up on sudden wealth. Today, wooden storefronts, tall false fronts, and raised boardwalks still line the road like a cast frozen mid-performance, waiting for the noise to start again. Visitors can sample hearty comfort food and Gold Rush-era Chinese cuisine, with specialties including Montreal smoked meat sandwiches, fresh sourdough, dim sum, and hot pot. When the noise of Barkerville finally falls quiet, the map points offshore, toward Haida Gwaii, a wild island group often described as the Galapagos of Canada. The islands are isolated enough that many plants and animals here took their own path, evolving into versions you won't find anywhere else. Around the shores, cold, fertile water feeds whales, seals, and huge flocks of seabirds, so a single bay can feel like a crowded meeting of fins, wings, and calls. Inland, tall cedar, spruce, and hemlock form rainforest draped in moss, turning some trails into green tunnels that stayed damp and dim, even on bright days. Haida stories and songs tie these islands to powerful beings and old events, and carved poles still stand in some places, holding those histories in wood. One of the most guarded places here is Gwaii, also called Ninstants, a sacred empty village that only a few people are allowed to visit. Its beach and longhouses were once full of Haida families and firelight, until disease from far away swept through and left the cedar homes silent. Along the shore, tall, carved mortuary poles still stand near the trees facing the ocean, raised long ago to honour the dead and their stories. These poles reflect a society deeply tied to the land, sea and spirit world, where Haida life is organised around the two great clans of Raven and Eagle. They chose not to move these poles into museums or restore them, but to leave them in place as they slowly weather, soften and return to the forest floor. But in the same shoreline, another figure moves through the tide-washed beaches, a coastal black bear found almost nowhere else. These Haida Gwaii black bears are extra big for their kind, with heavy skulls and strong jaws that look built for breaking tough food. Cut off on these islands for a very long time, and with no larger bears to outmuscle them, they quietly became the main heavyweight here. The clue to their shape lies on the shore, because a lot of their meals come not from the trees, but from rocks, sand, and shallow pools. When the tide pulls back, they flip stones like giant, furry waiters, lifting lids, snapping up crabs, mussels, and other hard-shelled snacks. All that shell cracking has turned their heads into serious tools, with teeth strong enough to bite through armour that would stop many other bears. They still wander inland for berries and plants, but the beach is their special buffet, a long salty line of rocky plates they know by memory. Island life is risky. Storms hammer the coast, food can shift from year to year, and a lean season can push even a big bear to its limits. Even so, they are not the only diners here, because the same abundant waters that feed the bears also draw in giants from far out at sea. Just beyond the tide line, dark backs roll through the waves, where humpback whales gather to eat. These giants travel huge distances to reach the waters around Haida Gwaii, like regulars returning to their favourite all-you-can-eat buffet. Several whales dive beneath a school of fish and blow streams of bubbles in a ring, building a moving wall of air. The fish refuse to cross that wall, so the circle slowly tightens until the whole school is packed into a tight ball near the surface. Then the whales rocket straight up through the middle, with mouths wide open, gulping water and fish in one explosive rush. This bubble net feeding is part trap, part teamwork and looks like someone pressed a feeding frenzy button. They also sing underwater, sending long winding calls through the sea like slow messages in liquid air. Not long ago, hunting pushed many humpbacks out of these bays, and their blows and songs almost vanished from this coast. Their steady return means splashes, tall spouts and the slap of huge tails are back in the same coves where they were once nearly gone. Out here the ocean feels alive again, but inland at Aniox, a once busy hospital, now stands over a town that has all but disappeared. This remote inlet once held a noisy copper camp of thousands, with rail lines, rows of small houses, and even a golf course built on piles of waste rock. The smelter that paid everyone's wages also poisoned the valley, and when copper collapsed and the mine closed, people left as fires later swept through the empty streets. Above the rust and broken walls, the hospital shell still stands, a hollow frame that once held new babies, broken bones, and last goodbyes. Far to the north, a tiny lakeside town called Atlin sits under icy summits, proudly wearing the name Switzerland of the North. It rests on the edge of Atlin Lake, the largest natural lake in British Columbia, a stretch of water so long and wide it feels like an inland sea. Glaciers feed this cold lake, grinding rock into fine powder that gives the water a pale, milky blue look when the light hits it. Gold once pulled crowds into these hills, turning quiet shores into a busy rush town with boats, hotels, and noisy docks. Now the pace is slow, but the stage is huge. Mountains rise straight from the water, and boats crossing the lake look tiny against the peaks. The lake can turn harsh fast. Even in summer the water stays icy, and sudden winds can whip up waves strong enough to flip a careless boat. On calm evenings, town lights and white summits reflect so cleanly that Atlin seems doubled, once on land and once upside down in the lake. From this remote town, the road runs south beside Atlin Lake until it meets the quiet O'Donnell River, once famous for early gold finds. The river slips into the east side of the lake like a calm silver ribbon, winding through spruce and willow, as if nothing important ever happened here. In the first rush years, prospectors line these banks, swirling muddy pans and watching for tiny flashes of yellow hiding in the gravel. Every flake they saw hinted that the hills might hold a bigger streak, turning this soft-spoken river into one more name in Goldfield gossip. Now the shouting is gone, and the O'Donnell moves on in near total quiet, its surface mirroring trees and sky instead of tents, hoses and dredges. Somewhere under that clear flow, the last grains of gold still lie mixed with sand, but the only digging comes from fish nosing along the bottom. South of these quiet northern rivers lies Cathedral Grove, one of Vancouver Island's most famous old forests, known for its massive, centuries-old trees. Here, Douglas fir and cedar grow so wide, while overhead branches knit into a green ceiling that turns daylight into a cool, dim glow below. For coastal indigenous peoples, cedar was far more than a tree. Houses, clothing, baskets, ropes, canoes, and ceremonial objects could all come from a single cedar. To protect the roots from so many feet, visitors move on wooden paths that float above the damp floor, weaving between fallen logs and towering pillars of bark. But even giants are not invincible, and a ferocious windstorm once tore through this forest in a single night, toppling some of the oldest trees as though they were matchsticks. Down among the moss and wet leaves at their feet lives one of the strangest locals in the forest, a bright, slow banana slug built for this cool, soggy world. As one of the largest slugs on Earth, it appears as a long yellow ribbon sliding over logs and leaves, like a piece of fruit that somehow learned to move. Its slime is a full body shield, keeping it wet and letting it slide over rough bark, sharp twigs, and even its own sticky trail. That same slime carries a trick. It can numb the mouth of anything that takes a bite, turning a curious lick into a tingly tongue and a fast no thanks. On the forest floor, this slow crawler works as a clean-up crew, munching dead leaves, fallen needles, and even animal droppings that others ignore. All that chewing turns waste into fresh soil, feeding the roots of the giant trees above and helping the whole grove keep growing. For such a soft creature, the plan is simple and bold. Be slimy, be strange, and be just annoying enough that no one wants a second taste. Tucked at the head of a misty inlet sits a town that gave up trying to stay dry a long time ago. Ocean Falls used to be a roaring pulp and paper town of thousands, with its own school, hotel, swimming pool, and a hospital busy with workers and families day and night. The mill ranked among the biggest in the region, and the hospital looked down on it from the hillside, watching over a place that hardly ever slept. When the mill shut and the wages stopped, most people left by boat, and a crowded company town shrank to just a handful of year-round residents. With rainfall measured in metres, residents relied on rain gear and covered walkways, joking that if they waited for sunshine, nothing would ever get done. On the shore of a long mountain lake, at the end of a brutal trail through the passes, a tent city called Bennett rose almost overnight for people chasing gold farther north. Through one frozen winter, thousands of stampeders crammed into those tents, not digging yet, but chopping the nearby forest and turning straight logs into boats. With fresh food scarce and costly, stampeders survived on staples like flour, beans, bacon and sourdough, whose starter was prized like treasure. All day the valley rang with axes, handsaws and hammers as people raced to finish a homemade fleet before the ice let go of the lake. Every spring, the shoreline became a giant shipyard as thousands of amateur carpenters hammered away at once in one of history's largest boat-building frenzies. The long, cold lake could flip overloaded boats, smash hulls on rocks, and swallow gear in seconds, yet the rush stayed so fierce that people kept pushing out anyway. Then the gold fever moved on. The huge camp melted away, and the shoreline was suddenly bare, with one small wooden church left staring across the quiet water. Far downstream, those same waters meet a valley of cliffs and canyons in Wellsgrey Provincial Park, carving out the roaring falls that earned it the name Waterfall Park. Among all those plunging curtains of water, one stands out so completely that it almost steals the whole park's name for itself: Helmerken Falls. Here the Myrtle River gathers its force and throws itself off a high cliff in one clean drop, a single roaring sheet that slams into the canyon below. In warmer months the air turns to flying spray, so loud and soaked with mist that the ground shakes and your clothes get wet even if you never step off the viewpoint. When winter locks in, that spray becomes building material, each frozen droplet landing and sticking at the base like grains of sand piling into a giant ice sculpture. Week by week, the frozen spray stacks up into a huge cone of ice, a white mound that can grow as tall as a many-storey building and look almost like a weird frozen volcano. Cracks, vents and little caves can open inside the cone, and if you listen carefully, you can still hear the waterfall roaring away, hidden inside its own icy shell. As spring starts to warm the canyon, the cone hollows out, then collapses in loud crashes of ice, sending broken chunks rolling down the slope, like a slow, icy landslide. Before long the cone is gone, canyon walls drip with meltwater, and Helmerken Falls turns back into a pure, thundering wall of liquid again. On the coast side of the province, Garibaldi Provincial Park unfolds between Squamish and Whistler, a tangle of sharp summits, cold forests, and crater-like basins filled with bright water. Long ago, lava and ice went to work here together, so hikers now walk on old volcanic rock, while valleys and ridges around them still show the scars of heavy glaciers. Black cliffs, bright snowfields and knife-edge ridges crowd the horizon, yet the park keeps one famous blue pool that pulls in most of the cameras and trail maps. Life in surrounding mountain communities is shaped by the land's limits, where food leans on survival traditions: dried salmon, smoked meats, hard cheeses, nuts and dense trail foods. Bear-proofing is part of daily life here, not just a backcountry rule. Food must be hung, sealed or stored away, since black bears often move through the lower valleys. Even movement follows the seasons. People shift between valley floors and higher alpine zones depending on snowpack, weather and temperature. High in its own rocky basin, that pool is Garibaldi Lake, a glowing glacial lake fed by nearby ice and wrapped in snow-capped peaks and hanging glaciers. The unreal blue comes from those glaciers slowly grinding rock into fine powder, which hangs in the water and throws back that cloudy turquoise colour. An enormous wall of old lava called the Barrier dams the lake, turning a frozen flow of volcanic rock into a cliff that holds back a huge bowl of icy water. That cliff is cracked and crumbly, and big chunks have collapsed before, roaring down as landslides and piling into the valley now known as Rubble Creek. Because of this, the land right below was officially ruled unsafe for people to live on, and a small community there was removed rather than risk a future dam break. On the edge of the island's coast, Bamberton turned raw limestone into cement for decades, its kilns blazing where kids now splash in a small sandy provincial park. At its peak, the plant roared with crushers, loaders and ships taking on cargo, while a close-packed company town clung to the hillside above the works. The cement made here went into major bridges, tunnels, dams and city towers, so this quiet inlet helped hold up much of modern British Columbia. Dust was equally constant, and workers developed strict routines for washing, cleaning, and even breathing around the fine particles. Music and leisure played a vital role, with community halls hosting dances, fiddles, and piano nights that offered workers an emotional escape from repetitive industrial life. When production finally stopped, the noise dropped away and the shoreline was left with old piers, rail beds, and concrete pads slowly sinking under moss and blackberry vines. Families now camp and barbecue where workers once changed shifts, trading cement dust and shift whistles for warm waves, salmon fishers, and evening campfires. Just outside the busy streets, Lynn Canyon opens into a cool green gorge where clear water rushes through a rocky crack beneath a skinny bridge that trembles as people walk across. This suspension bridge has its own kind of mischief, because while a more famous crossing nearby charges a fee, this one has always swung free for anyone brave enough to step on. Below it, the creek has carved smooth rock bowls that on a hot day look like perfect wild swimming pools. Bright, calm, and almost too good to resist. The trouble is those pools hide shockingly cold water, strong undercurrents and hidden rocks, and over the years they have turned deadly for people who took them too lightly. People here learn to read water like language, where colour, foam and speed signal whether a creek is safe or dangerous. Once you've felt how quickly shade, cold water and steep rock can change the mood here, you start to look differently at the bigger mountains piling up inland. In the mountains beyond, Revelstoke lives with towering snowbanks and long, stormy winters, a place where heavy snowfall is simply how the year works. Locals call it Revelstuck, because when big storms hit, highways shut down, trains crawl, and the whole town turns into a shaken snow globe. That snow loads the slopes above town, with powder so thick that skiers and snowboarders can sink almost to their chests on the best days. Yet down in the valley, everyday errands roll on, so you can grab groceries on the main street and be cutting fresh tracks on the mountain before your ice cream even softens. Watching over it all is Mount Revelstoke, one of the rare peaks where you can start in thick valley forest and drive most of the way toward open alpine meadows. The meadows in the Sky Parkway climbs from cedar and hemlock forests into spruce and fir, then rises to alpine lakes and flower-covered hills where the trees thin and pavement ends. Short trails at the top lead past clear ponds to rocky lookouts, where Revelstoke lies far below, and lines of clouds stack up along the surrounding ridges. On a good day, you can leave town in drizzle, drive through fog bands, and step from your car into warm sun and blooming meadows, all on the same mountain, in under an hour. Below all this, the Trans-Canada Highway squeezes past town and runs west into a tight gap where cliffs drop straight to the water's edge. In that narrow slot, Three Valley Gap appears almost out of nowhere, a lakeside castle and ghost town tucked between steep rock walls and still water. The chateau dresses itself as a mountain castle, with long rows of balconies facing Three Valley Lake, so most guests wake up staring straight across the water instead of at the highway. Just behind it, the heritage ghost town gathers a saloon, schoolhouse, jail, and dozens of rescued pioneer buildings into a frontier street that never existed in one place before. At one end, a covered rail roundhouse packs in old locomotives and cars around a working turntable, so a full-size engine can still be spun like a toy in the middle of the valley. Outside, the lake quietly steals the show, a long, narrow strip of water pressed between slopes and often so smooth that the castle, trains and clouds all appear again, perfectly upside down. Past the stage storefronts, Parkhurst offers the real thing, a forgotten sawmill town in the woods, its last shacks and machines crumbling above the water. It was once a tight little camp built around a roaring mill, with bunkhouses, cookhouses and family homes all timed to the scream of saw blades. When the contract stopped and the mill fell silent, people left in a hurry, and the woods slowly pushed back in along the empty roads and yards. Beyond the sagging shacks and stumps, the Fraser Valley opens into rows of crops, fruit trees, and pasture land. This flat plain was built from mud and silt the Fraser River dragged out of the mountains, leaving behind soil so fertile that people call the region British Columbia's breadbasket. Each high water season, the river presses against its dikes and drops fresh sediment, a natural top-up that keeps fields growing, even as farmers race to keep floods out of barns and roads. In warmer months, the air smells of berries, grass and dairy barns, while just beyond the fences, salmon push upstream, through side channels and creeks that thread the farms, Scattered through this patchwork of fields and ditches, towns act as service hubs for the farms, and one of the biggest names on that map is Chilliwack. Its name comes from a word often translated as Valley of Many Streams, or as far as you can go upriver, fitting a place threaded with creeks and side channels. Chilliwack is a farming heavyweight, with hundreds of operations turning the flat valley soil into milk, berries, vegetables, flowers and eggs that stock store shelves across the region. Local rivers nearby offer salmon, trout and even giant sturgeon, so this is one of those rare spots where farm country and big fish stories share the same backdrop. A short drive east, the pavement runs straight toward Bridal Veil Falls, where a tall sheet of water spreads over rock like a white veil hanging between the trees. Instead of one hard drop, the creek fans out over a smooth rock face, splitting into thousands of thin streams that drift down the cliff like long trailing ribbons. On bright days, the mist catches the sun and throws tiny rainbows across the spray, so the veil seems to flicker and move every time the wind tugs at it. In cold snaps, that spray can freeze onto the cliff and nearby branches, building an icy wall that looks solid and still, even though water keeps rushing behind it. The walk is only a few hundred yards on a gentle trail, where kids, grandparents and road trippers in sandals all end up at the same spot, staring up into the falling sheet. Further out from these damp trees and farm towns, the land dries out and the valleys narrow again, trading moss and ferns for bare rock and hot wind. Up in the dry interior, Seaton Lake lies near Ucluelet as a slim 22-mile strip of turquoise, wedged between high, sun-baked cliffs. The unreal colour comes from distant glaciers, grinding rock into fine flour, which drifts into the lake and hangs in the water, bouncing back that milky blue-green light. Along one shore, a narrow highway and a rail line cling to ledges in the rock, so cars and trains thread the canyon on strips of pavement, and steel barely wider than the roadbed itself. On calm days, the surface turns glassy, doubling every cliff, trestle, and power line so clearly that the whole valley looks copied and flipped upside down. The bottom drops away fast from shore, which keeps the water icy cold even after long heat waves and makes casual swimming feel more like dunking into a giant liquid freezer. High above the lake, rough tracks and old roads climb into the hills, where scars of tunnels, adits and rock piles show where miners once chased veins through this hard country. Tucked in that tougher ground is the Molly Gibson mine, hidden in steep alpine terrain where loose rock, snowslides, and thick brush still make access a challenge. The workings cut straight into hard mountain rock, with narrow adits and steep tunnels that once sent out high-grade ore and now feel more like chilly caves for marmots and meltwater. In its busy years, miners strung tramways across gullies so ore buckets could swing through open air, but heavy winter snowslides were powerful enough to rip whole sections of line away. What's left is a scatter of rusted wheels, cable parts and collapsed timbers on unstable slopes, best explored in photos and history rather than on foot. Below the high, crumbling workings, life feels very different on the shores of Kalamalka Lake, where people paddle over water so colourful it looks almost painted. Also known as Kal Lake, it is one of the world's rare marl lakes, laden with limestone from long ago glaciers, keeping the water unusually clear and largely free of weeds and murky algae. As summer heats up, calcium carbonate in the water forms tiny crystals that act like prisms, turning sunlight into bands of turquoise, jade, and blue across the surface. That is why people call it the Lake of 1,000 Colours. In a single view, you can see pale green near shore, darker blue in the middle, and bright streaks of teal running between them. When the lake cools, the crystals dissolve and the vivid greens fade, and the surface slides back to a calm blue until the next warm season brings the colour back. National Geographic has named it among the world's most beautiful lakes, a fact locals like to mention while standing on a beach that looks more like the tropics than inland Canada. On Vancouver Island, another small town has also staked its name on colour, but this time in paint, with Caminus covering its streets and shop walls in giant outdoor murals. When the sawmill that fed the town finally shut down, it was close to fading away, so locals made a sharp turn and decided to paint their history on every bare wall they could find. Huge scenes of log drives, harbour life, indigenous stories, and old-time storefronts spread across buildings, until walking downtown felt like moving through a life-size picture book. Visitors now follow mural maps through alleys and side streets, checking off walls the way other travellers tick off famous monuments. The town saved itself by turning its past into public art, so history class here happens on brick, stucco, and the backs of hardware stores instead of in a textbook. A few hours away in Tofino, the main canvas is the ocean itself, with surfers using each new wave to redraw the horizon. Here, people wrestle into thick wetsuits and paddle out all year, chasing long Pacific lines while cold rain stings their faces and wind shakes the logs on the beach. In winter, storm systems from far out in the North Pacific slam into this coast, throwing up heavy swells that can rattle windows and send spray flying higher than the treetops. Life on this outer edge comes with a quiet warning, because just offshore, the Cascadia subduction zone is slowly locking and straining where one plate drives under another. Sirens, phone alerts, and yearly high ground drills turn the town into a safety classroom, teaching that if the shaking starts or the sea drops, you run uphill fast and don't wait. On calm evenings with small waves sliding in and wetsuits dripping on doorsteps, it feels almost peaceful, yet no one forgets how fast this water can shift from playground to threat. Standing on a rocky point at the entrance to a busy harbour is a proud red and white tower that has been doing its job longer than almost any other on the entire western coast. This is Fisgard Lighthouse, the first permanent guide on Canada's Pacific shore, built so ships would not gamble their hulls and crews on a dark approach. In its early years, keepers and their families lived on site, climbing narrow stairs in every kind of storm to win the gears and wipe the glass so the beam stayed sharp. Wild nights turned the place into a front row seat of danger, with wind screaming around the lantern room, waves pounding the rocks, and the keeper watching for any ship drifting offline. Locals still talk about boats that seemed headed for trouble, until that flash of light cut through the spray like a voice from shore saying, "Not that way." Now machines handle the beam, but the tower still stands over the channel like an old traffic guard, watching every passing hull. Perched where the mountains plunge down to meet the sea, sits a town that has crowned itself the outdoor recreation capital of Canada. And it has the scenery to back up the boast. Squamish feels like a place designed for motion, where bike racks spill onto sidewalks, climbing ropes hang from balconies, and daily plans revolve around tide charts and trail reports. Long before climbing ropes and mountain bikes, people here lived from these waters and forests, harvesting salmon, shellfish, game and berries from dugout canoes. Before wheat reached the coast, they made a flat bread-like food from the inner bark of red alder, using the forest itself as a source of nourishment. Just beyond the town's edges, a huge granite wall called the Stawamus Chief rises over 2,000 feet, drawing climbers to its near-vertical slabs. Hikers climb steep routes of roots, ladders and rock, then crowd the cliff edge viewpoints where trains, highways and boats below shrink to miniature scale. The valley's shape also creates the famous inflow and outflow winds, conditions locals monitor almost as closely as the weather forecast. The sea-to-sky highway threads through town as a constant stream of roof racks, muddy vans, and travellers moving between ocean surf and alpine snow. From here, the highway continues a short drive south to Shannon Falls, where water drops in a single pale ribbon from sheer cliffs into the forest below. This waterfall is taller than most office towers, plunging more than 1,000 feet down granite rock and ranking among the very highest falls in the province. Instead of one clean leap, the water sprints down a steep staircase of ledges, smashing and sliding so fast that it turns white and loud long before it hits the bottom. The Squamish people tell of a giant two-headed serpent that dragged its body again and again down this cliff, carving the groove that the creek now races through. On busy days, the paved trail fills with families and road trippers, and the mist at the viewpoints sprays faces, lenses, and picnic snacks in seconds. If you watch the flow twist around knobs of rock and surge through its narrow channel, it's easy to picture that serpent still racing the water to the base. In spring, snowmelt swells the creek until the falls hit the rock with so much force that you feel a faint thump in your chest, like standing near a giant drum. Then comes Cody, a fading mining town that feels like a different world, where the clatter of ore carts has been replaced by wind slipping through broken boards. Once this valley shook with blasting powder and rang with hammers as miners chased shiny veins through the rock, while ore cars rattled out of the hills loaded to the brim. Now only a few wooden frames, rusted cables and collapsed roofs remain, and walking among them feels a bit like stepping onto a stage, long after the actors have gone home. Standing among Cody's ruins, it's hard to imagine that not so far away, the shoreline turns into a maze of Gulf islands, each one its own little patch of docks and beaches. These islands lie in the rain shadow of tall mountains, so they get more sun and less cloud than many nearby places, giving them an almost holiday feel, even when the mainland is soggy. On warm slopes, twisted arbutus trees with smooth copper-coloured bark peel in the sun, making some hillsides look more like a dry country than typical coastal forest. Ferries, small boats and float planes set the rhythm, and people here talk about trading traffic lights and long commutes for tide tables and short walks to the dock. Over time, that slower pace has pulled in painters, writers, potters and musicians, turning barns, sheds and old shops into studios scattered across the islands. Down at the waterline, tide pools crawl with tiny dramas, crabs, snails and shell-covered rocks, all jostling for space as the sea moves in and out. Along those same rocky edges, one bird stands out. The black oyster catcher, a loud shoreline specialist that patrols the rocks and cracks into shellfish with an orange bill built like a crowbar. They feed at low tide, stalking exposed rocks and checking every crack and pool for mussels and limpets to pry loose. That bright beak works like a tiny chisel, prying limpets off rock, smashing barnacles and sliding into shells before they can clamp shut. Here, each bird pair treats a short stretch of shore like home turf, pacing up and down the rocks and yelling at any oyster catcher that lands too close. Many stay with the same partner for years, moving together like a small patrol and calling back and forth as if they are checking that the other is still on watch. Their loud whistling calls are so distinctive that scientists often count them by ear. You hear them long before spotting their dark bodies against the rocks. Though common along the shore, they lay few eggs each year and depend on undisturbed rocky nesting sites, making the Gulf Islands' protected coastlines vital for their survival. The coast seems to enjoy its characters, and one of the grandest stands inland in stone, Hatley Castle, a stately old home that cameras keep returning to for superhero stories. A coal baron paid for this mansion and was famous for saying the cost did not matter, so the result feels less like a house and more like a private palace facing the sea. Turrets, great halls, and a sweeping staircase give it the look of a storybook castle, even though it once held a single family and their guests instead of kings and queens. Its second career eclipsed the first, as film crews turned it into everything from Xavier's School for Gifted Youngsters to the homes of comic book billionaires and TV villains. Many visitors walk up the drive with a strange feeling, then spot a doorway or tower and blurt out, "Wait, that's the X-Men school," because they've already seen it on screen at home. Between shoots, it returns to daily life. Students inside, film crews unloading gear on the lawns outside. One patch of stone has hosted real families, naval cadets, students, superheroes, and villains, turning this single estate into a kind of greatest hits reel for both history and fiction. On the banks of the Great River stands a modest wooden fort with a huge claim to fame. This is known as the birthplace of the entire province. Fort Langley began as a Hudson's Bay Company post, where furs, salmon, cranberries, and barrels of supplies moved through its gates long before any big city grew nearby. The fort's timber walls once heard the words that created the colony of British Columbia, spoken not in a marble hall, but in a smoky yard lined with log buildings. Outside those walls, gold fever surged as boatloads of newcomers pushed up the Fraser, while inside a small group with ink and paper quietly decided how the region would be run. The place worked as a crossroads where indigenous traders, company clerks and hopeful miners met, each seeing a different future in the same muddy river and wooden palisade. Today, costumed staff light fires, bake bannock and hammer metal on real forges, filling blacksmith shops and cookhouses with heat, smoke and noise. School groups still crowd into the courtyard where the colony was proclaimed, acting out the moment with feather pens, flags and loud voices that bounce off the log walls. Just outside the gates, the modern village leans into its past with cafes, antique shops and festivals, treating this birthplace of BC as a living main street. The same province that began in Fort Langley's courtyard also reaches Colmont, a tiny Wild West-style village of boardwalks, swinging doors and silent mining streets. This dry valley town once exploded into life when coal seams and a new rail line turned a quiet corner of the province into a place of bunkhouses, saloons, and black dust on every doorstep. The boom faded, trains thinned out, and most people moved away, yet an old frontier hotel still guards the main street, its wood worn smooth by miners' hands and boots. Now only a few dozen neighbours keep Colmont going, living among rusting machinery, fading signs and yards where old cars and mine gear feel like part of the town's furniture. Community gatherings here are spontaneous and grassroots, from unannounced acoustic jams and gold panna celebrations to off-road club meetups. Coalmont and Granite Creek are twin relics in the Similkameen, with Granite Creek born in a gold rush and Coalmont arriving later on coal and rail. Where two creeks meet, it erupted almost overnight after a cowboy found gold in the gravel and the news raced through the hills. At its peak, the town swelled into one of the biggest settlements in the province, crammed with hotels, saloons, and rows of tents that seemed to double every time another pack train arrived. Mixed in with the gold dust, miners tossed aside dull silvery lumps as useless, later revealed as platinum, worth more than gold. The rush cooled. Fire took what was left, and the creeks now slid through a quiet clearing, far from Deep Cove's calm waters in Indian Arm. At the far end of this long, narrow sea inlet, mountains lean in around a snug little community that locals simply call the Cove. The village hugs the shoreline so closely that from the main street you can watch kayaks and paddleboards glide past like a slow parade on the water. On still mornings, the surface turns to glass, and seals, or sometimes even a whale, can pop up beside paddlers with almost no ripple at all. Above town, a short, steep trail climbs to a rocky ledge where people crowd together for a view that makes the fjord below look like a long, flooded valley carved by old ice. Back at street level, the mood flips to cosy as a small bakery draws a line down the sidewalk, all for one donut that has become a local habit as much as a snack. Families plan whole days around this mix. Hike first, paddle next, then reward tired legs with a box of pastries eaten on the pier. All this calm water and small town charm pairs nicely with a very different kind of showpiece inland, Craig Darragh Castle, a huge, ornate house dressed up to look like a fortress. Perched above the city on a hill, this stone mansion was built by a coal magnate who spent his fortune on turrets, stained glass, and carved wood instead of ledges and stocks. The place was meant to be the final word on his success, a private palace where every staircase and fireplace quietly announced how far coal money had carried him. In a twist worthy of a novel, he died before it was finished, so the grand front door he planned to walk through as Master first opened without him. His family moved in anyway, filling the rooms with daily life, while knowing the house had turned into a monument to someone who never spent a single night there. Over time, the building has been a military hospital, college, music school, and now a museum, with the same grand staircase carrying wounded soldiers, students, and tourists alike. And rising above a busy alpine village is a mountain that anchors the continent's largest ski resort, a sweeping expanse of snow and runs that pulls visitors from around the world. Whistler Mountain has carried the very best winter athletes down its slopes, yet on the same runs you'll still see beginners edging along while experts rocket past just one lane over. High above the trees, a peak-to-peak gondola links it to its twin, hanging so far over the valley that a ride between the two peaks feels closer to flying than sitting on a lift. On some days, clouds drift below the cabins, so you look down on a soft white layer while dark ridges and glaciers poke through like islands in a strange sky. For all that scale, the name Whistler comes from something small, a stocky, hoary marmot whose warning call is a sharp whistle that can carry across whole slopes. In summer, these marmots lounge on warm rocks near the top, then explode into noise when a hiker, dog or eagle comes too close, acting like furry alarm sirens for the mountain. When the snow melts, bikes replace skis, and riders launch down the same runs on dirt, while marmots watch from burrows, proving the mountain is just as busy in July as it is in January. The action that starts on icy slopes ends in rolling waves, where northern sea otters bob in the surf like furry corks, cracking open shellfish with stones on their chests. These otters have the densest fur of any animal, so thick that cold Pacific water barely reaches their skin, turning their coat into a fluffy wetsuit full of trapped air. They have no blubber like seals or whales, so they stay warm by grooming non-stop and by eating a huge amount of food each day. Life as one long snack break. Under each forearm is a loose pocket of skin where they stash favourite rocks and bits of food, then pull out that same stone again and again to smash open crabs, clams and snails. Pups ride on their mother's belly like fuzzy life jackets, while she combs their fur for ages so they stay dry, light and floaty. Adults often nap in groups called rafts, holding paws or wrapping themselves in long kelp so they do not drift apart while they sleep. Their hunting can flip an entire coastline because a hungry group will chew through sea urchins that would otherwise mow kelp forests down to bare rock. Once the urchins drop and the kelp grows back, fish, crabs and snails flood in, turning those underwater forests into busy neighbourhoods powered by otters' big appetites. In this corner of the coast, Zeballos shows how boomtowns return in new forms, trading heavy machinery for small lodges, charter boats, and quiet-seeking visitors. Once roaring with gold rush crowds and logging trucks, this village now sees anglers, kayakers and whale watchers replacing miners underground. Old bunkhouses and shopfronts now share the waterfront with docks and tiny inns, so the same inlet that carried ore and supplies now sends out fishing skiffs, zodiacs and eco-tour boats. With only a few hundred neighbours, news travels fast. Bears on shore, otters offshore, whales at the inlet's mouth. This little coastal village shares a province with Kelowna, a much larger place where hills once used for orchards now carry miles of vineyards above the water. In a sun-drenched valley beside a long lake, it has become a major wine hub, where grapes hang longer in warm summers and mild falls. Steep slopes striped with vines run down toward Okanagan Lake, so at some wineries you can swirl a glass while looking straight at the rows that filled it, only a short walk away. The lake at the centre of it all carries its own legend. Ogopogo, a serpent-like lake monster said to haunt the depths, now more common on t-shirts and signs than in clear photos. Its name reaches back to the Syilx people, where Kelowna comes from a word for grizzly bear, so every welcome sign quietly nods to that older meaning. Modern life here mixes farm and resort, work among vines in the morning, swim or paddle by afternoon, then patios at night as bats sweep over warm, lingering lake air. All this soft light on vineyards feels a long way from Headley's sharp slopes, where crumbling tram towers and ore buckets still hang over the canyon, like props from an old mining film. High above the town, the mascot mine clings to bare rock, its wooden buildings bolted straight onto a cliff, so steep it feels like one wrong step would drop you into the valley below. Instead of rolling carts on the ground, miners moved ore in heavy cable buckets, using descending loads to haul empties back up. On wild nights, wind still whistles through empty frames and rattles loose boards, and locals joke the mountain is testing who's bold enough to mine it again. This hanging maze of stairs and cables gives way next to sea air and city paths in Stanley Park, a famous green space even larger than New York's Central Park. Inside this giant park, tall evergreens rise right out of the city, so one moment traffic roars by and the next you are under branches that block most of the buildings from view. Along the seawall path, joggers and cyclists pass herons on the rocks, harbour seals in the waves, and, on rare days, orcas sliding close to shore. Winter storms can slam in so hard that whole trees fall in a single night, opening sudden clearings where a solid wall of trunks had stood the day before. Raccoons here act like tiny city bandits, working open bins and bags, while huge flocks of crows and noisy gulls gather at dusk and shout louder than the cars for a while. Many people also share older stories about powerful beings tied to this shore and forest, pointing out that this land held meaning long before towers and condos rose behind it. Among trees, paths and sea views, Brockton Point stands out, where painted totem poles have become one of the region's most visited attractions. Tall cedar poles line up like a wooden crowd, each carved and painted in a different First Nation style, with whales, bears, ravens and human figures stacked high above the ground. Every pole tells a story without words, sharing family lines, crests and powerful beings, so standing here feels like walking through a row of giant storybooks carved from wood. Many poles on display are careful copies, while the original carvings have been moved indoors to keep them safe from rain, wind and salt air. Visitors arrive from around the world with cameras ready, yet the strongest moment often comes when people lower their screens, look up in silence, and simply take in the faces above them. Out among the fertile farmland of the valley sits a friendly community that has built its identity around one humble crop. In Agassiz, corn is such a star that summer fields turn into tall green walls, and local signs and events happily claim the title Corn Capital of British Columbia. Warm days and river fog help the plants along, so ears grow thick and high, while kids stand in the rows and check if they're as tall as the stalks. On late summer evenings, the air smells of boiled cobs and grills, and neighbours hand each other bags of corn over fences, the way other towns might share cookies. After farm roads and produce signs comes Kamloops, a city packed with rinks, courts and fields that has earned the nickname Canada's tournament capital. Over 100 tournaments run here each year, filling the tournament capital centre, a riverside sports complex, and a huge bike park built for serious jumps. These hills and valleys double as a playground, with giant parks, riverside trails, and more golf courses per capita than anywhere else in Canada. Kamloops spreads across a meeting of rivers, with tan hills and bare bluffs rising up around low, wide neighbourhoods. Downtown, boxy brick buildings, rail lines and bridges share space with long green park strips along the water. The land holds an older story, Secwepemc territory, where people have lived along this river meeting place for thousands of years before Kamloops appeared on a map. Movies and shows turn the dry hills, trains and streets into sets for dinosaur chases, sci-fi scenes and small-town dramas. Summers run hot and dusty, with wildfire smoke shaping tournaments as athletes watch the sky as much as the scoreboard. Even when big events end, the games keep going, with local clubs, Special Olympics programs, and pickup matches filling gyms and fields long after the medals have been handed out. Where Kamloops measures weekends in tournaments, Butchert Gardens measures seasons in blossoms, filling its many acres with changing patterns of flowers. The Star is a sunken garden, shaped like a giant green bowl that used to be a scraped-out limestone quarry, an empty pit where crews once dug rock instead of planting roses. Now visitors can stand on the rim and look down into a maze of fountains, ponds and flower beds layered below their feet, as if a whole park had been poured into a crater. Summer nights bring another surprise, when strings of small lights trace the paths and trees, and the garden becomes a glowing maze of beds shining like lanterns. Even winter keeps a bit of magic here, with evergreen shapes, careful lighting, and cold weather plants giving colour, while many other parks turn bare and grey. From this former quarry, now blooming with flowers and lights, the route moves back toward busy streets and towers in Burnaby, one of the largest cities in British Columbia. Glassy high-rises stand not far from long rows of houses, so one side of a hill can feel like downtown, while the other feels like a quiet block where kids bike past corner stores. Near the centre of the city, a forested mountain holds a university on its top, with classrooms along the ridge and trails dropping quickly into thick trees below. On lower ground, huge shopping areas have grown around train lines, turning old parking lots into busy hubs where people step straight from rapid transit into malls and offices. Film crews turn these streets into a stage, so a Burnaby block might be a small American town one week and a futuristic city the next, unnoticed by most viewers. Large parks and lakes push right into the middle of town, giving locals places where they can watch ducks and herons in the morning, and walk past office towers or film sets by afternoon. The urban maze of Burnaby eases into open sky and waves at Kitsault Beach, a famous English Bay shoreline anchored by Canada's longest saltwater pool. Locals call it Kits, and on hot days the sand turns into one long shared living room, with volleyball games, paddleboards and picnics packed along the shore. Just above the tide line, a huge saltwater pool runs about 450 feet in one go, letting swimmers crank out long laps while real waves sparkle just beyond the pool wall. Behind the sand, the neighbourhood takes its name from Squamish chief Kitsault, and this easygoing surf scene sits on indigenous land with a much older story. In the 1960s, it became a hippie hotspot, with musicians, activists and flower power kids filling its beachside streets. Even today, people still talk about that free-spirited past when they spread towels on the sand, as if a bit of that old counterculture is still sunbathing beside them. Easygoing beach days at Kits line up neatly beside wide, farm-ringed Abbotsford, whose boundaries cover more ground than any other city in the province. One municipality holds long rows of houses, big box stores and huge berry farms all at once, like a single city laid over an entire patchwork of fields. In warm weather, berry rows run in straight stripes toward the hills, and some mornings the air over the fields smells so sweet it feels like walking through a desert. Once a year those big skies turn into a stage, as jets and stunt planes roar over the airport, and quiet farm roads suddenly fill with cars and people looking up. The flattest part of this farmland was once a shallow lake, drained so tractors could roll where boats used to glide. When a massive flood hit in recent years, water swept back over roads and barns and briefly turned sections of the valley into the lake they used to be. The fertile ground here stretches toward the Okanagan Valley, a place where grapes, not corn or berries, have become the star crop. Long hills above the towns are striped with vineyards, and on hot days the air can carry a faint smell of warm grapes and dust, as if the whole valley were baking fruit in the sun. This is one of the country's warmest, driest regions, so dry in spots that pale hillsides and sparse shrubs give it a near-desert feel, while careful irrigation keeps each vine fed. In the south, rattlesnakes share the rocky slopes with vines, curling on sun-baked stones between the rows in this still wild wine country. Even so, nights cool quickly, letting the grapes rest and build their flavours, while wind slides down the hills and the valley finally quiets. Down the middle of it all runs a single long lake that feeds canals, creeks and pumps, turning what would be high desert into a chain of farms, orchards and wineries. This long ribbon of water also works as the valley's playground, lined with beaches, docks and fishing spots that all point toward Okanagan Lake, as the region's natural spine. Towns, orchards and vineyards lean toward its shore, so kids skip stones, wakeboarders tow behind boats, and irrigation pipes pull water for fields and gardens along the same edge. Calm mornings turn the surface into glass that mirrors dry hills and forested slopes, broken only by the call of birds and the long wake of a single fishing boat. On windy days, the mood flips fast, as whitecaps slap the rocks, small boats race for shelter, and people on shore watch the waves pound harder and higher. Beneath that choppy water lives the lake's most famous tale, the legend of Ogopogo, a long serpent-like being people claim to see in sudden splashes or rolling shapes far from shore. Scientists talk about logs, waves and big imaginations, yet shops, mascots and local jokes have turned this monster into a permanent resident of the lake, at least in people's minds. This water and myth feeds real migrations as fish push into creeks each fall, leading to kokanee salmon, the red fish named in local indigenous languages. Unlike most salmon, kokanee in Okanagan Lake never reach the sea. They hatch, grow, feed and spawn all within fresh water, like homebodies who skip the ocean gap year. They start life as tiny specks in gravel, grow into slim silver fish out in the lake, then turn back toward the very streams that first sheltered them. When spawning season hits, their bodies flip into bright scarlet with dark heads, so whole creeks suddenly look as if someone poured a moving red ribbon through them. Each fish drives upstream on stored energy alone, dodging rocks and predators, using every last burst of strength to reach shallow gravel where new eggs can safely fall. Once the eggs are laid and fertilised, the adults soon die and break down, and their bodies go back into the water and soil that feed the next wave of young. People along the valley watch these red swarms from bridges and banks, then later spot them in local dishes and stories, linking the little salmon that stayed home to everyday life. While kokanee paint creeks red in the valley, Granville Island packs colour into its own maze of shops, studios, and theatres beside the water. This busy scrap of land began as a hard-edged industrial yard, but today its public market bursts with fruit, fish, spices, and hot snacks, so every aisle feels like a tiny food festival. Around the market, old warehouses now hold glassblowers, woodworkers, painters and actors, where you can watch glass being shaped, see a play, and grab fresh donuts within a short walk. Kids weave between toy stalls and candy counters, while little ferries buzz in and out of the docks, and the harbour becomes part of the playground. The oddest sight is a full cement plant still rumbling away in the middle of all this art and food, its tall silos painted bright colours so heavy, industry and culture literally share the same yard. On misty mornings, the air smells like coffee, ocean, and wet concrete at once, showing that this island is still a working place beneath the street performers and souvenir shops. As night nears, theatre crowds and market shoppers drift back across the bridges into Vancouver's glow, the province's largest and most powerful city. Glass towers rise between ocean and snow-tipped mountains, so on clear days the skyline looks like a line of mirrors, catching both white peaks and blue water at once. In winter, people brag that they can ski in the morning, rinse off the snow, and be back on a sailboat or paddleboard that same afternoon, all without leaving the city. Streets here carry food and languages from across the globe, so one short walk might pass steam buns, tacos, curries, and fresh bread, each doorway offering a different smell. At night, film crews quietly turn blocks into movie sets, so Vancouver spends its evenings pretending to be New York in one show, Tokyo in another, or a made-up city in a superhero world. Long rainy spells fuel constant jokes, as locals pedal past in drizzle with hoods up, insisting it's just a bit of rain, while tourists scramble for shelter. When the clouds open, people flood the seawalls and park lawns, and the city suddenly feels like one big shared backyard wrapped around the shoreline. All these towers, bikes and film lights gently angle toward the sand, ending the day at English Bay, the city's best-known beach and favourite sunset spot. On warm evenings, the seawall turns into a slow-moving parade, with walkers, joggers and skaters gliding past while big ships glow like floating apartment blocks out in the bay. Summer nights can feel like a stadium without walls, as huge fireworks burst over the water and crowds pack the sand to watch colours flare over both waves and glass towers. In winter, hardy swimmers line up for the famous New Year's polar bear plunge, charging into icy water just long enough to scream, laugh, and brag about it later. Calmer days bring seals and seabirds close to shore, so a quick swim or paddle might come with a whiskered head, popping up only a few yards away. When the sun drops, voices soften and almost everyone turns west, as if the whole bay shares one long pause to watch the sky turn gold, then orange, then blue again. Close to the seawall, a tower of carefully balanced stones forms a silent stone person, linking this busy beach to Inukshuk markers used by Arctic indigenous peoples as signs and guides. Each arm and leg is just a flat rock locked in place by weight and balance, so the whole figure stands without any glue or bolts, held up only by gravity and careful stacking. In the far north, structures like this once pointed towards safe routes, hunting grounds, or good fishing spots, so spotting one here hints at long journeys and shared paths across very different coasts. The human-shaped Inungoak feels like a stone figure saying, "Someone has been here before you," grounding the form in living culture rather than garden art. At English Bay, cameras click all day as people pose against sunsets, fireworks and storm clouds, turning this guidepost into one of the city's most photographed faces. For many visitors, though, it also works as a quiet doorway to think about Arctic lands and communities, whose ideas and designs now stand watch over this southern shore. The calm gaze of this rock figure points beyond the bay, toward Victoria, where government buildings line another busy shoreline. What keeps people here is how the city feels like a small town and a capital at once. Your barista at the harbour market in the morning might be on stage with a local band that night. Food ties land and water together, with small kitchens cooking salmon, crab, and vegetables that often come from just across the strait, so dinner can feel only a ferry ride from its source. Canada's oldest Chinatown packs history and daily life into tight lanes like Fantan Alley, where families speak several languages and people slip into bakeries, herb shops, and noodle houses. Festivals fill the year, dragon boat races in the harbour, music and film events in parks and theatres, so locals joke the city hardly remembers a truly quiet weekend. All these threads, food, festivals, soft winters, and close-knit streets, pull people to one shared hub, the inner harbour, where ferries, float planes, buskers, and office workers meet at the water's edge. On a short stretch of quay, seaplanes lift off, music drifts from buskers, and the smell of fish and chips or fresh crab hangs over the docks. Dragon boats, sailboats, water taxis, and whale-watching tours weave through each other all day, so the harbour feels less like a postcard and more like a shared project in motion. Food and drink tours even use tiny harbour ferries as moving dining rooms, hopping between pubs and cafes in a loop around the waterfront. Behind it all, the British Columbia Parliament buildings rise in stone and glass, tying the busy harbour to provincial politics. From the front lawn, the building looks like a storybook castle wired for real power, with wide steps, arched windows, and a long row of statues quietly watching people come and go. Tiny carvings of birds, animals, and local plants tucked into the stone, as if the region's forests and shorelines have been coded into the walls. The designer once hid his own full-size statue high on the facade, which turned the building itself into a long-running joke about ego, art, and who gets remembered. Inside, school kids walk the same halls as premiers and party leaders, tracing polished floors where debates over forests, pipelines, and housing can shift the province's direction. During big debates, the chamber fills with sharp voices, slammed desks, and quick whispers in the back rows, while clerks in traditional black robes keep everything just inside the rules. The grounds outside pull in another kind of gathering, from quiet lunch breaks on the grass to protests with homemade signs that turn the front steps into a loud public stage. Even on calm days, you can stand at the edge of the lawn and feel a strange mix of cruise ship crowds, local office workers, and lifelong residents all folding into one shared civic scene. From here, decisions ripple out across mountains, islands, and inlets, so that a voice raised on these steps can change how a distant bay in British Columbia feels tomorrow. This is British Columbia, a land of hidden wonders and remarkable architectural marvels. Now, if you don't want to miss the most unreal wonders of Alberta, check out this video.